August 23, 2000. Bahrain. Gulf Air Flight 072. 143 souls. A 6-year-old Airbus. Unlimited visibility. A perfectly functioning aircraft. 36 of the passengers were children. The airline had the tools to prevent every single error that killed them. Those tools had never been turned on. How does a plane crash on a clear night with a working runway right beneath it? The answer begins not in the cockpit, but in the boardrooms and training centers of an airline that had spent the better part of a decade quietly dismantling its own safety nets. An airline that canceled the one program designed to teach its co-pilots how to speak up. An airline that purchased monitoring equipment for every aircraft in its fleet and never once activated it. An airline that shortened the restrictions on new captains flying with inexperienced first officers, then paired 2 of its weakest pilots together on a routine evening flight from Cairo. By the time that flight reached Bahrain, the captain was barreling toward the runway at twice the normal approach speed. The first officer sitting next to him said nothing, and when the captain finally admitted the approach was lost, he made a choice that sealed the fate of everyone on board. Not because he lacked skill, not because the airplane failed him, but because the system behind him had failed long before he ever left the ground. This is the story of Gulf Air Flight 072. To understand it, we need to go back to Cairo, earlier that same day, where a captain and his first officer were about to begin what should have been a perfectly ordinary flight. That afternoon, the crew of Gulf Air Flight 072 gathered at their hotel in Cairo. The captain, a 37-year-old Bahraini national, had spent the previous night at the hotel casino with some of the cabin crew before heading into the city for coffee and gifts after midnight. He did not get back until past 2 in the morning, but the flight was not scheduled until 4 in the afternoon, so he reportedly woke feeling well rested. The date was the 23rd of August, the year 2000, and their assigned trip was Gulf Air's regular service from Cairo to the small island nation of Bahrain, east of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. The captain had joined Gulf Air as a teenage flight engineer cadet back in 1979. Over 2 decades, he worked his way through the ranks, serving on the L-1011, the Boeing 767, and the Airbus A320. He had been promoted to A320 captain just 2 months earlier, that June. After taking 3 weeks of vacation in late July, he had accumulated only 86 hours in command by the time of this flight. Most colleagues described him favorably, but he had only narrowly passed his upgrade check ride after receiving poor grades on 2 emergency maneuvers, and some noted a tendency toward overconfidence, with occasional resistance to suggestions from his first officers. His first officer that day was a 25-year-old Omani national who had been flying the A320 for Gulf Air only since April. His total experience amounted to 608 hours. His training record was rough. He had initially failed his A320 proficiency check the previous October, receiving the lowest passing grade on 7 different items, including VORDME approaches, normal landings, and automation management. Captains who had flown with him described him as timid, meek, and slightly reserved. He had difficulty with unfamiliar situations. He did not ask clarifying questions. He hesitated to challenge the captain. One instructor had deliberately exceeded taxi speed limits during a simulator session to test whether the first officer would speak up. He did not. Despite being very new to the job, he already had a previous incident on his record from January, where his aircraft struck debris on takeoff and could not pressurize. The internal investigation found poor airmanship and awareness. He was sent for remedial training. The aircraft was a nearly 6-year-old Airbus A320, registration Alpha 4 Oscar Echo Kilo, in excellent technical condition with no significant faults. It had been delivered with quick access data recorders installed, devices specifically designed to let airlines monitor flight data across their fleet and detect dangerous patterns before they turned into accidents. But Gulf Air had never activated them, on this airplane or on any other in their fleet. The weather was clear along the entire route. Warm temperatures, not a cloud in the sky. Everything pointed to a routine flight. In the cabin, 6 attendants oversaw the boarding of 135 passengers, families returning to Bahrain after holidays in Egypt. children squeezed between parents in economy seats, infants held on laps, carry-on bags stowed overhead. The cabin door closed on 143 souls in all. The flight was supposed to depart at 4 in the afternoon, but the pilots arrived late after ground staff directed them to the wrong gate. The captain seemed upset when he arrived. The delay pushed departure to 4:52, meaning they would not reach Bahrain until after 7:30, well after sunset. The captain was pilot flying. The first officer handled radios and monitoring. They pushed back, taxied, and lifted off into the Egyptian afternoon without incident. The cruise across the Arabian Peninsula was uneventful, the sun setting behind them as they headed east into darkness. But inside the structure of this airline, decisions had already been made that would shape everything that followed. Gulf Air had started an in-house crew resource management program in 1992, designed to teach cockpit communication and teamwork. That program was canceled in 1996. The airline's human factors manager tried to restart it. He made no progress. He resigned. His replacement hit the same wall. When Oman required all airlines to have CRM programs in 1999, Gulf Air contracted a third party. A dispute delayed everything. By August 2000, training had still not started. Neither pilot on Flight 072 had ever received any real CRM training, and soon, everything would depend on skills they had never been taught. As Flight 072 began its descent toward Bahrain, the aircraft was within the Dammam air traffic control sector in Saudi Arabia. At 1921 local time, descending through 14,000 feet, the Dammam controller cleared the flight to proceed directly to the initial approach fix for runway 12 at Bahrain, and to descend to 3,500 feet. The first officer read back the clearance and switched to Bahrain approach. But when Bahrain asked the crew to confirm their altitude clearance, the captain had misheard. He believed they were only cleared to 7,000. He told the first officer to report 7,000. The first officer complied without question. Bahrain simply repeated the instruction: descend to 3,500. That misunderstanding may have caused the captain to descend too slowly at first, and now, needing to catch up, he pitched down and let the speed build. Whatever the exact cause, Flight 072 began accumulating excessive speed, well above 300 knots. There was no operational reason for it, no other traffic in the area, plenty of airspace to descend. Instead, investigators later concluded that the captain may have deliberately used a higher speed to make up for the late departure, and possibly to impress his brand new first officer. During the descent, the captain had tried to demonstrate his ability to quickly set up the navigation system without the first officer noticing, then bragged about it. He was showing off, and the first officer, who had never been taught to question a captain, just watched. That speed would compress every decision from here on into a shrinking window of time. Most parts of the world enforce a speed limit of 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Bahrain did not have one officially, and while most airlines enforce the limit internally regardless, Gulf Air had no such policy. So as the aircraft descended below 10,000 feet, well above 300 knots, nothing in the system flagged it. No rule stopped it. No alarm sounded. The only safety net left was the voice of the first officer, and that voice stayed silent. To understand why speed mattered so much here, you need to know how a landing sequence works. An airplane approaching to land follows a carefully choreographed slowdown. At predetermined distances from the runway, the pilots extend the flaps in stages to increase lift at lower speeds. They lower the landing gear. They reduce thrust. Each flap setting has a maximum speed, because at higher speeds, the aerodynamic forces on the surfaces can exceed design limits. If the pilots fall behind the sequence, the entire chain backs up. They cannot configure for landing until the speed is low enough, and they cannot slow down fast enough if they wait too long. Flight 072 was flying a VORDME approach to runway 12. This type of approach uses a radio beacon to define the inbound course and a distance measuring system to track progress toward the field. Unlike a precision instrument landing system, a VORDME provides no vertical guidance. The pilots manage their own descent by stepping down to specific altitudes at specific distances. It requires discipline. And above all, it requires being at the right speed and altitude at the right time. The approach chart called for the crew to be at 1,500 feet and fully configured by 9 nautical miles from the station. Flaps full, gear down, speed within 10 knots of 136 knots. When they reached 9 miles, they were at 1,873 feet, nearly 400 feet too high, and their airspeed was 313 knots, more than twice the approach speed. The aircraft was not remotely close to being configured for landing. The captain had a clear and simple option: request the holding pattern or radar vectors to bleed off speed and altitude. It would have added about 5 minutes. That was it. But he did not ask, and the first officer, whose entire job was to monitor the approach and flag problems, said nothing. Not about the speed, not about an alternative. He sat in silence. The captain extended the speed brakes and pressed on toward the final approach fix, without saying a word about how he intended to resolve the situation. There was no discussion of a plan, no suggestion of an alternative. The first officer's role as pilot monitoring was to speak up when parameters deviated from normal, to say something like, "Captain, our speed is well above limits. I suggest we request vectors." But this first officer, who had no CRM training, who had been described as someone who would not challenge authority even when an instructor deliberately tested him, just watched it happen. As the aircraft crossed 7 miles, the final approach fix, the gear was down but flaps were only at 1. Speed was 224 knots, nearly 90 knots above the approach speed. Altitude, 1,678 feet, still almost 200 feet too high. Gulf Air's procedures required the aircraft to be fully configured before this point. Flaps full, speed stable. That requirement existed precisely because non-precision approaches demand full attention once the descent begins. There was no possibility of meeting it now. The approach was already lost. The only question was whether the captain would admit it. If you subscribe to this channel, you already know situations like this rarely end well. But what happened next reveals something far deeper than one pilot flying too fast. The captain announced that he was visual with the airfield and switched to visual approach rules, which allowed him to lower the approach gate from 1,000 feet down to 500. He was buying himself time, but it was the kind of time that buys nothing. At 1,000 feet, speed was still 207, 70 knots too fast. Flaps still only in position 1 out of 5. The A320 has 5 flap settings, each selected at progressively lower speeds. With the speed still this high, the captain could not even command the next flap stage without risking damage to the surfaces. The captain called for flaps 2, and then, 15 seconds later, he said it out loud. "We are not going to make it." He knew. The approach was lost. Standard procedure was simple and clear. Go around thrust, pitch up. Climb straight ahead on the runway heading to 2,500 feet. Return for another attempt. A few extra minutes and everyone gets home safely. But that did not happen. Instead, the captain disconnected the autopilot. He turned off the flight directors, the instruments that would have shown him a target pitch angle during any subsequent maneuver. And he told the first officer to request a 360-degree left orbit, an orbit on final approach, below 600 feet, on a moonless night over the Persian Gulf. A trainee controller in the tower, working under supervision, approved the request. He should not have. An orbit below minimum safe altitude was not a permitted maneuver, but neither he nor his supervisor recognized the problem. Why would a pilot choose this over a simple go-around? Studies show that intentional deviation from procedures becomes more likely under 4 conditions. The expectation that rules need to be bent to get the job done. High confidence in one's own ability. Opportunities to save time or fuel, and inadequate planning. All 4 were present here. Some Gulf Air flights had done orbits on final before. An orbit saved the time and paperwork of a go-around. The crew had not briefed the go-around procedure, and the captain's overconfidence told him he could pull it off. But the most important factor was the airline's culture. Gulf Air officially said no pilot would be punished for a go-around, but it required them to submit an air safety report explaining why. That paperwork created a perception among some pilots that go-arounds were viewed unfavorably, and once pilots believe that, they will take risks to avoid them. The captain rolled left into the orbit. The aircraft passed over the airport and out over open water. The lights of Bahrain began sliding behind them. Ahead was nothing. the pitch-black surface of the Persian Gulf meeting the pitch-black sky with no horizon between them. He was hand-flying in full landing configuration, in a turn, at low altitude, over featureless water, with no flight director showing him where to point the nose. The flight data recorder tells the story. Altitude swung from 332 feet to 965. Bank angle peaked at 36 degrees, well past the normal maximum of 25. Inside the cabin, passengers would have felt the aircraft tilting and shifting, the city lights swinging past the windows and then vanishing into darkness. In the tower, controllers watched the erratic radar track with concern. But as the aircraft neared the runway centerline again, they reissued the landing clearance. The first officer called runway in sight. The captain spotted the airport lights and instinctively leveled the wings. But he leveled too early. The aircraft was now flying almost perpendicular to the approach course. The captain cursed. We overshot it. He resumed the turn, advanced the thrust, and told the first officer to announce the go-around. It had taken him nearly a full orbit of fighting the aircraft in the dark to arrive at the decision he should have made from the beginning. Now he had to execute a go-around from the worst possible position, turning, low, fast, disoriented, stressed, with the flight directors still off. The go-around procedure is straightforward. Apply go-around thrust. Pitch up to 15 degrees. Retract flaps one stage. Verify positive climb. Retract the gear. These are memory items. Pilots are supposed to know them cold. But Gulf Air did not include normal go-arounds in its recurrent simulator training, and the stress of this moment would have made recall far more difficult. The captain pulled back to nearly 14 degrees, close to the target, but then he eased the nose down, below 10 degrees, below 6. He likely did not know he was doing it. His attention was consumed by the turn, the configuration changes, the radio calls. Meanwhile, the aircraft was accelerating. Go-around thrust on an A320 is enormous, and with the nose dropping, that thrust pushed the airplane forward and down. And here, the captain's body betrayed him. The acceleration pushed him back in his seat. His inner ear could not distinguish that force from the sensation of pitching nose up. His brain read it as a climb. This is somatographic illusion. It has killed pilots before and since. The only way to see through it is to cross-check the attitude indicator or look at an outside horizon. But the flight directors, which would have displayed a clear target of 15 degrees right on the primary flight display, had been turned off. He had switched them off himself during the orbit, and outside the windows there was only black. A continuous chime erupted in the cockpit. The aircraft had exceeded the maximum flap speed for position 3. The first officer called it out. The tower issued a new heading and frequency. The captain swore, and then the last lights of Bahrain disappeared behind them entirely. Within 2 seconds, the captain pushed forward on the stick. The nose dropped to -5 degrees, the maximum the A320's flight envelope protections would allow. The aircraft was now pointed at the water, accelerating past 250, with full go-around thrust driving it downward. Then the ground proximity warning system activated, sink rate, followed by the most urgent words in aviation. Whoop whoop, pull up. Whoop whoop, pull up. Every second, for 9 seconds. Neither pilot reacted. The correct response is immediate and absolute. Nose up, full thrust. It is drilled into pilots through repeated simulator practice, precisely because in a crisis, the conscious brain may not be available. The response has to be instinctive. It has to live in muscle memory. But Gulf Air did not practice the terrain escape maneuver in recurrent training. Both pilots had done a single GPWS scenario during initial training. That was all. The investigation later described the captain's brain as a single-channel processor that had reached capacity. Under extreme stress, the brain sheds stimuli it cannot handle. Hearing is often the first to go. The captain most likely could not hear the warnings. The first officer almost certainly could. But without training to prioritize between the flap overspeed and the pull-up command, he followed the captain's lead on the flaps. The last words on the cockpit voice recorder were the first officer confirming that flaps had been retracted to 0. 2 seconds later, at 1930 local time, with a nose-down pitch of 6.5 degrees and an airspeed of 280 knots, Gulf Air Flight 072 struck the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf. The aircraft broke apart on impact. All 143 people on board were killed instantly. The wreckage came to rest in roughly 3 meters of water, 4 kilometers northeast of an airport that had been right there beneath them the entire time. Bahrain declared 3 days of national mourning. At Cairo Airport, crowds of families gathered at the gates, desperate for word of loved ones who would never arrive. At the crash site, rescue teams and Navy divers worked through the night, recovering remains from the warm, shallow water. Among the dead were 63 Egyptians and 34 Bahrainis. 1/3 of the passengers had been under 18. 26 were children under 10. 18 were under 5. The wreckage field stretched across the shallow seabed, pieces of fuselage and personal belongings scattered in water barely deeper than a swimming pool, within sight of the runway lights. The investigation that followed refused to stop at the cockpit. Investigators traced the thread back through the airline and found a system that had been quietly rotting for years. Gulf Air had been jointly owned by Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Abu Dhabi since 1973, serving as a joint flag carrier with routes stretching from New York to Australia. During the 90s, financial pressures set in, and the airline began cutting where it should not have cut. Oman's aviation regulators sent numerous letters concerning safety violations across flight operations, training, and record-keeping. Many received no reply. Others were inadequately corrected. The airline was sanctioned repeatedly. Its extended-range operations were restricted. Several crew licenses were suspended. Inspectors found no CRM program, no quality management, no safety awareness training. The airline did not simply fail to comply. It actively opposed the existence of many of the regulations it was violating. The probationary pairing restriction for new captains, originally set at 40 flights, was cut to 20 in 1999. The flight data monitoring program that could have flagged dangerous patterns across the fleet existed only on paper. The quick access recorders sat dormant on every aircraft. Gulf Air had the tools to see the risk building in its own operations. It chose not to look. And then there was the go-around culture, the paperwork requirement, the perception it created, the unspoken pressure that hung over every unstabilized approach. The investigation found that this culture was not incidental, it was structural, and it had consequences that reached all the way into the cockpit of Flight 072. The cinematographic illusion that likely killed the crew of Flight 072 was not a new phenomenon. Similar accidents had occurred before and would occur again. Fly Dubai Flight 981 in 2016, Tatarstan Airways Flight 363 in 2013, Armavia Flight 967 in 2006. In each case, a pilot became disoriented during a go-around and made nose-down inputs while believing the aircraft was pitching up. The defense against this illusion is not awareness alone, it is training, repeated, rigorous simulator practice that retrains the instinctive response until the correct action, pull up, becomes automatic. Gulf Air had not provided that training, and the flight directors that would have given the captain a clear visual anchor against the illusion had been turned off by his own hand. Simulator trials conducted after the accident proved one devastating fact. If the captain had pulled the nose up within 2 seconds of the first GPWS warning, the aircraft would have survived. 2 seconds. That is the margin this airline's failures had erased. In the aftermath, several key personnel at Gulf Air and the Oman Aviation Authority resigned. Contractors were brought in to overhaul the airline's safety culture from the ground up. Gulf Air suspended its instructor appointments and training programs to make sweeping improvements. CRM training was implemented for all pilots and cabin crew. Go-around practice was added to recurrent simulator sessions. New procedures were introduced for speed management, stabilized approaches, and visual maneuvering. The airline moved to eliminate any perception that go-arounds were discouraged. And the flight directors that the captain had switched off during the orbit received a permanent fix. An Airbus-approved modification now causes the flight directors to automatically re-engage whenever go-around mode is activated. A pilot can still choose to turn them off, but in the critical first seconds of a missed approach, when spatial disorientation is most likely and the correct pitch attitude matters most, the target is right there on the display, 15 degrees, showing the pilot exactly where the nose needs to be. The quick access data recorders were finally switched on. Gulf Air scaled back dramatically as Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and Oman withdrew their stakes to build their own carriers. But the airline survived. It still flies today as the flag carrier of Bahrain. And since the tragedy of Flight 072, it has not had another serious accident. On that August night in 2000, an Airbus A320 flew a perfect cruise across the Arabian Peninsula under a clear sky and arrived at a fully operational airport with unlimited visibility. 143 people were minutes from home. The captain reached for the flight director switch and turned it off. Nobody in that cockpit and nobody in the airline behind them understood what that small action would cost. If you found this story as difficult to hear as it was to tell, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. Every one of these accidents carries a lesson buried inside it, and some of those lessons are still being ignored today. In our next video, we will look at a flight where the crew did everything right, followed every procedure, responded to every warning, and it still was not enough. Because the one thing that could have saved them was a piece of information that someone, somewhere, had decided they did not need to know.